we present Beowulf, an original adaptation, written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Part 12. The Sword. Beowulf saw the knife coming, though he was powerless to react. He had no idea where she had pulled it from, but he caught a glimpse of the firelight glancing off dull steel as it plunged down towards him and drove directly into his chest. The wind was knocked from him, and he waited for the pain, followed by the sucking, squelching sound as the blade was withdrawn. But it never came. There was pain, yes, but not the pain of a knife thrust, not the pain of bleeding, not the pain of a mortal wound sapping his life. There was a mutual moment of confusion, as both Beowulf and Grendel's mother looked down at his armoured chest, eyes wide. The beast recovered first, and threw the knife aside and gouged at the mail shirt with her talons. But the work of Wayland lived up to its legendary status. With a scream of frustration, she rose up, her clawed hands reaching for Beowulf's unarmoured throat. Seizing this moment where her body no longer pinned him, Beowulf drove his foot into her stomach and heaved with all his might, flipping her bodily off him and sending her scrambling back into the shadows. Beowulf stole a heartbeat to haul in breath, the massive weight of the creature now lifted, and then hurriedly found his feet as well. He could not see Hrunting, and besides the weapon was no use against her. So, empty-handed, Beowulf swiveled slowly, craning his neck and searching the shadows, while Grendel's mother bided her time and waited. Time and again she flashed past him, silent and invisible. Those talons raked at him, finding gaps where the armour did not give protection. Beowulf did not like the realization, but he was scared now. This was not like Grendel, who had fought him directly, pitting strength against strength. Grendel's mother, aware she was not as strong as her son, fought with cunning and craftiness, using all of her advantages to mitigate his own. If it weren't for the armour of Wayland, he'd be dead by now 3 times over, and he knew it. He also knew that time was not on his side. This cave was deep underwater. No dawn was coming to drive away the darkness, and before long those fireballs would burn out, and then he would be truly helpless. Offering up a desperate prayer, he scanned the cave again, looking for any advantage he could find. And he saw it. Mounted on the wall was a great sword, almost twice the size of Hrunting, but it wasn't just the size that held his attention. While all the other weapons and armour there were rusted and pitted with age, this one still gleamed bright. Either it was a new addition to the wall, or else it held some magic that defied the usual signs of decay. Choosing to hope for the latter, Beowulf braved crossing into the shadow and scrambled to the wall, wrenching the great blade down. It was indeed huge, but it did not feel heavy. It shone brightly in the firelight, but it did not feel new. It felt ancient. Smoke-like shapes and whorls wound their way across the grey surface of the blade, and the golden hilt was marked with runes he could not read. It did not seem like it was crafted by any smith of men, not even Wayland himself. It must be of some other folk, maybe the dwarves, or more likely the giants. Despite the damp cold of the cave, he felt a warmth flow into his hands where he held the sword, and Beowulf knew that he was holding something truly spectacular. This moment of contemplation had all taken less than a second, the knowledge landing with him in an instant, and his head swiveled back into the darkness, anticipating the next attack from Grendel's mother. Now, though, he hefted the mighty sword and stood ready. It was not perfect. Twice more she swiped past, and though Beowulf brought the blade to bear, he could not land a strike. With the sword in his hands, though, Grendel's mother gave a wider berth, and Beowulf took no more wounds. The third time she attacked, Beowulf heard her. Again, some rustling of her hair as she moved was all the warning he received, but it was enough. It was only the wet thud and the yelp of shock from Grendel's mother that let him know his cut had landed, for there was no resistance on the blade. Instantly, the monster ceased her attack, standing stock still. Both Beowulf and the beast stared at her arm, now bathed in black blood. The enchanted sword, in its perfect arc, had sliced clean through her wrist and severed her hand away. Grendel's mother was making little gasping, panicking sounds as she stared at the severed stump, her eyes wide. Those eyes, suddenly fear-filled, swiveled towards him, and for the first time their gazes locked. In the same instant they both let loose a battle cry, howling their defiance at each other, and for the final time the two were drawn together in an ugly, frenzied fight. Beowulf surged with bloodlust and battle rage. Still, though, he tamed the fire and forced his mind to focus. Despite her injury, Grendel's mother was a terrifying opponent, and now she fought with the fierce intensity of a cornered animal. No more sneaking, measured attacks that took their time. Now she simply wanted to end him. Even years later, Beowulf could not have said how long the battle went on. It could have been days or it could have been mere moments. But gradually, with the armour of Wayland and the great enchanted sword, Beowulf beat the beast back. In the final few moments, the monster lunged out with her one remaining hand, seeking to swipe those deadly claws across his eyes. Beowulf dipped his head forwards, letting the strike ride up onto the protection of his helm, and brought his sword up in a smooth cut. The blade took the creature on the underside of her arm, slashing deep as black blood flowed. Pressing his advantage, Beowulf drove forward to send her crashing to the ground. She let out a straining gasp as the wind was knocked from her, but Beowulf did not stop to hear it. He did not pause, he did not hesitate, he only continued the flowing attack, bringing the sword down to slice neatly through the creature's throat. He stepped back, sword still held out and wary, eyes searching for any sign of attack. But it did not come. The monster's hand came to her throat, trying to hold in the blood now flowing from her. Her eyes met Beowulf's for a second time, but she found no pity there. At the last she sought out the body of her son, taking her hand off her neck and reaching out for him instead. There, finally, the two of them lay lifeless together. Beowulf stood, his breath coming in great gulps like a stallion after a chase. He looked down at the two bodies, and all of a sudden all the exhaustion, all the fear, all the adrenaline, all the anger, all of it welled up inside him. He threw his head back and roared a shout into the empty cavern, so loud and so long he was convinced it shook around him. Or perhaps it was him that shook. He could not tell whether it was a cry of anger or regret or relief or just the sheer need to remind the universe that he was still alive. But somehow it felt good. He felt good. In fact, he felt giddy with triumph. He looked down at the mighty weapon in his hand, and the thought crossed his mind that with this sword and his armour of Wayland he could become the mightiest warrior ever to walk these lands. Visions danced across his imagination, and in them he was a mighty warlord, a warrior of living legend who no foe could overcome. Drunk with the notion, he brought the sword up before him and stared at it, searching for a trophy he could harvest. Looking around, he saw the prone body of Grendel, and he knew what his trophy would be. Stepping to the body, he brought the blade down in a smooth, slick motion, and the monstrous head rolled cleanly away. He strode around the cavern, clutching the sword tightly, eager for some new thing to strike at, when a strange, acrid smell reached his nose. It cut the air harshly, and Beowulf brought his sword up, certain some fresh horror was approaching. It was then that he noticed the blade. Where Grendel's blood had touched it, the blade was being eaten away. Before his eyes he saw his great sword wither and melt, until all Beowulf held was the hilt. Somehow, in parting, Grendel had paid one final ill deed upon him, and his visions of being a warlord hero began to fade. As did the firelight. In alarm, Beowulf realized the cave had dimmed significantly, and the fireballs were burning low. Hurriedly, he scrabbled around until he found the fallen sword grunting, and clutching it tightly with the hilt of the giant sword, he took up the head of the monster Grendel and set off out of the cave. "You have returned, my son!" cried Hrothgar as he strode from the water, blinking in the brightness. The king's party plied him with questions, and he recounted his adventure without varnish. He was, quite frankly, too exhausted to embellish or exaggerate, and he told the tale with raw honesty. It was far from his finest storytelling, but as he finished, the small crowd were rapt with attention. The king took the hilt of the giant sword in his hand and stared in wonder. "A relic of a forgotten time," he breathed, the awe writ large in his voice. "You are most blessed to have wielded it." "Indeed, uncle," Beowulf agreed wryly, "though I would have liked to wield it a little while longer." The king looked at him, that magic twinkle in his eye, and cocked his head to one side as if he were listening to something. "You know, when the monks came and brought their Christ to our shores, I did not care to listen at first, though I knew you did. One phrase stayed with me, though, from one of the stories. I can't recall which, you must forgive an old man. For such a time as this, their God would place the right people in the right place for the right purpose, for such a time as this. Perhaps this blade was only gifted to you for such a time as this. Besides, I do not think you have any difficulty becoming a great warrior and lord of men with or without an enchanted sword. Anyone who has met you can see that that fate was written on you from birth. Anyhow, you must forgive the ramblings of an old man, and we must leave this place and return you to Heorot in triumph. I dare say the Danes have another celebration in them, and I dare say that you might welcome some rest and about a week of sleep." Beowulf was too exhausted to know what he really wanted that night. To fight one Jotun monster in a lifetime would make a man a hero amongst his people. To fight 2 in 3 days, it seemed, would make a man utterly exhausted and weary to his bones. Still, the thought of a good hearty meal, a fine ale, and the chance to be with his friends and family again seemed very attractive just now. Yes, friends and family and food were what he needed now. Friends, family, food, and sleep. Thanks for listening. Beowulf was a Settle Stories commission, written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Story editor was Miriam Sarin. Intro music was Warrior by Hartzman. Outro music was Travel in the Ocean by Monument Music. It was a Parable Arts production.